It began with a glare that turned the New Mexico night into a bleached noon, and it did not end when the desert fell silent again. Between the 16th of July 1945 and the 9th of August 1945, power itself changed its grammar, and every negotiation acquired a hidden soundtrack. The United States held a device that could erase not only armies, but options, strategies, and illusions in a single pulse of heat. Anyone facing an American envoy now heard, beneath the polite vowels of diplomacy, the distant hum of engines at altitude. A monopoly was born, and with it a new tempo for treaties, ultimatums, and rescue plans. From that moment onward, the calendar of the world beat to a clock set in the desert. How did nuclear leverage first take shape at the bargaining table? At Potsdam in late July 1945, Harry Truman carried in his pocket the small knowledge that everything had just shifted. The Alamogordo success was written in the ink of lab reports, but it read like a change of weather over continents. Words in the plenary stayed courteous, yet their center of gravity moved a few inches toward Washington. Secretary of State James Burns urged that the new advantage be a silent weight behind positions on Poland, reparations, and lines on the map. Across the table, Joseph Stalin kept a mask of composure while his staff tightened their own timelines for a Soviet bomb. In corridors where stenographers stacked fresh carbons, pauses lengthened, and glances began to count as sentences. The novelty was not only destructive power, but speed, reach, and the impression that distance had ceased to protect. A map could no longer comfort by its scale, because 10,000 meters up was the same everywhere. What did Hiroshima and Nagasaki do to the structure of bargaining? On June 8, 1945 and September 8, 1945, the political calendar heard a noise louder than any siren. Japan's capitulation on August 15, 1945, closed a theater of war and opened a theater of demonstration. Every capital that studied the ashes understood logistics as a new philosophy. If a weapon could cross oceans, then a telegram could carry a different tone, and delay could look like risk. When American envoys argued for liberalized trade rules or coordinated occupation policies, their paragraphs carried the shadow of B-29 silhouettes. Deterrence was a young word, but its syntax was already shaping schedules, red lines, and the way officials inhaled before they spoke. The message to Moscow was a double exposure. Join an ordered system if you will, but know that disorder now has costs that need no rehearsal. Even silence became communicative, because a world that had seen two suns could hear what went unsaid. The absence of threat was itself a measurement to be taken in the minutes between meetings. How did the monopoly seep into everyday cables, conferences, and flight plans? In 07.1946 Operation Crossroads, through white columns into the Pacific sky at Bikini. Those images wandered from newspapers into briefing folders, and then into the nerves of ministries. At the same time, the Strategic Air Command took shape, a bureaucracy of readiness whose paperwork was a map of runways and crews. Teleprinters rattled out training cycles, fuel allocations, and coded routes that traced the edges of Eurasia. Protection turned into a package of engineering and promise, bundled from tonnage, aviation gasoline, and signatures on base rights. Memoranda that once drifted for months began to pick up deadlines that matched production schedules in assembly plants. The idea of keeping conflict local grew brittle against the fact of range. One could now imagine a crisis as a trajectory rather than a frontier, and that changed how ambassadors weighed verbs. Numbers stopped being abstract. A sentence like expected yield in Q4 entered the room with the force of a squadron. Why did the attempt to leash the bomb through an international regime fail? In 1946, Washington advanced the Baruch Plan, offering an international atomic development authority with sweeping inspections. The logic promised safety by trading secrets for verification, but it reflected the geometry of a world where one side alone had the device. For the Soviet Union, inspections without veto looked like foreign eyes in the engine room of sovereignty. Moscow demanded abolition of existing bombs first, trust to be proven by disarming the only armed hand. The United States required the opposite sequence, verification before dismantlement, and would not surrender the only leverage it possessed. Negotiations froze not because imagination ran out, but because the order of steps was itself a strategic choice neither side could concede. Thus, the monopoly remained unbound by shared rules and instead bled into the architecture of American-led order. Economic programs, security guarantees, and military doctrines began to rhyme with the shape of the new power. Read the Baruch Papers, and you hear the ticking of an advantage measured in months and factory shifts. Watch the plan collapse, and you can see mistrust harden into the final argument. How did nuclear superiority shape the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan? In March 1947, Truman told Congress that free peoples must resist coercion. Greece and Turkey became the first proofs that dollars could be escorted by the possibility of bombers. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, looked like economics, yet its spine was a theory of stability backed by capacity to punish escalation. Reconstruction would feed cities and repair machines, but it would also make political centers less flammable. Officials counted wheat and locomotives and also counted minutes to wheels up and arcs of approach. Credibility was the bridge between paper promises and the last step no one wished to test. Monopoly did not replace alliances, it accelerated them. Under the umbrella, partners accepted rules that lowered barriers and standardized payments, because order felt cheaper than improvisation. In backrooms, the arithmetic of aid aligned with the arithmetic of range. Aid made governments less hungry, and range made their adversaries think twice. Which crises from 1946 to 1948 displayed the bomb's silent presence most clearly. In Iran in 1946, Washington pressed for Soviet withdrawal from the North and attached to the note a new definition of agreement. The text was ordinary, the shadow behind it was not. Moscow stepped back, not only because of the words, but because the costs of testing them had become unknowable. That same year, the Straits crisis built pressure at the Bosporus, where geography had long been destiny. American support for Ankara grew, and Mediterranean patrols spoke a quiet sentence about reach. These were not nuclear ultimatums spoken aloud. They were demonstrations that projection had acquired another layer, a layer that could be felt even when radios were off. Out of that layer came a grammar of no that fit in a few clipped lines of cable traffic. With every small success, the sense spread that the threshold was nearby, even when unseen. Self-restraint began to look like a strategy rather than a concession. How did the monopoly change the contest over Germany and Berlin? By 1947, the bizone had fused in the West, an administrative move that looked to Moscow like the mortar of a future wall. In June 19th, 48 currency reform reset the tempo, and the Soviet blockade of Berlin answered with pressure. The Western airlift turned logistics into heartbeat, planes landing minute on minute at Tempelhof and Gatow. Above the propeller wash hung the unsaid, because both sides could imagine what a single shot might trigger. Washington and London kept options in drawers, options that relied on only a few dozen charges but infinite consequences. Soviet planners calculated whether downing an aircraft would cross a line after which the sky itself might glow. The blockade stayed just below the border where local risk would fuse with global annihilation. The success of the airlift was a diplomatic victory for deterrence that required neither proclamation nor trumpet. Behind it lay a map of bases, arrows from Nebraska across the Azores into the Rhine. On that map, asphalt was policy, and radio beacons were paragraphs. How did Moscow react internally, and why did this accelerate the Soviet road to the bomb inside fenced institutes? The memory of Stalingrad met the terror of a single flash over a factory city. Urgency became doctrine, and doctrine became a calendar as engineers turned borrowed sketches into blueprints of their own. Every American ultimatum was read as rhetoric plus R. Every test photo from the Pacific was filed as both physics and prophecy. Intelligence shortened paths, but resolve provided the engine. On 29th of August 1949 at Semipalatinsk, the Soviet Union answered the monopoly with a sun of its own. The exclusive era ended not by accident, but because it had manufactured the necessity of parity. From that hour, negotiations moved from unilateral pressure to a balance of terror whose rules would need long decades to right. The world felt colder and paradoxically safer, because each side now feared itself as much as the other. In that fear, diplomacy regained room for half-tones and careful breathing. How did the United States translate technology into credibility in practice? Under Curtis LeMay, the Strategic Air Command made readiness a religion. Air crews drilled on polar routes, tankers rehearsed rendezvous, and ground teams turned checklists into choreography. On British airfields at dawn, lamps threw cones of tungsten over steel skins, while navigators traced pencil lines on paper charts. Route names remained classified, but their existence leaked into the way Allies negotiated basing rights. Who can launch at any hour bargains differently for harbors, overflights, and tarmac. Thus was born a diplomacy of runways, in which an agreement about concrete carried the weight of a communiqué. Contracts for fuel and spare parts doubled as insurance policies. They told adversaries that intention was backed by the machinery to create pressure points in hours, not weeks. More than once, a quiet message about heightened alert did the work of a paragraph. Talks stepped back from edges that suddenly looked steeper. Which home front debates amplified outward firmness despite lean arsenals in the early years. Production of cores and casings wobbled after 1945, and numbers stayed modest at first. But public expectation set a high bar that leadership must not slip. Senators asked about price tags while generals sketched target systems in chalk on blackboards. Budget fights over housing and steel braided themselves to plans for radar chains in Alaska and Canada. Promises of strength preceded the factories that would fulfill them. Yet those promises were believed abroad because exercises, deployments, and photographs of flight lines kept arriving. Credibility was not a spreadsheet value, but a pattern visible to hostile analysts with binoculars. The bomb became a metronome that trained the state to move faster even when it chose not to strike. Drafters at State, Treasury, and Defense wrote with the knowledge that a crew stood waiting in a hangar. That knowledge trimmed clauses, shortened deadlines, and stiffened guarantees. Why does the monopoly phase matter far beyond the archives? It shows how technology shifts the syntax of choice, not only the volume of threat. It also shows that advantage without rules breeds insecurity that only institutions can tame. The founding of NATO in April 1949 was not merely a reply to Soviet pressure. It was an experiment in distributing responsibility for deterrence across many capitals and many electorates. Today, when officials speak of extended deterrence and escalation management, they argue in the echo of those late 1940s rooms. Transparency, verification, and shared procedures remain the grammar that can make fear governable. The lesson is disciplined coherence. Capabilities, aims, and rules must rhyme, or else red lines invite tests rather than prevent them. When that rhyme holds, risk declines. When it breaks, local arguments can find the fuse that leads off the page. What changed on August 29, 1949, and why did the imprint of the monopoly years endure? The Soviet detonation shattered exclusivity, but habits learned in the shadow of one-sided power persisted. Washington kept the conviction that economic order, military basing, and technology policy only work together. Soviet strategists mirrored that conviction and replaced helplessness with parity. The language of ultimatum gave way to the language of balance, even as both languages kept an accent of fear. The following years filled with test series, command diagrams, and alliance treaties. The deeper change was a kind of humility born of terror. Quick victories looked implausible, and uncontrolled consequences looked near. Statesmen began to keep space for ambiguity, because ambiguity was sometimes the only bridge left standing. The residue of the monopoly era was a map of institutions and habits of restraint. It proved that superiority becomes durable only when it writes itself into rules that allow the weaker a future. How can the first nuclear years be turned into a present-tense rule of thumb? Technological lead is an amplifier, never a substitute for legitimacy. The United States used its nuclear edge to open rooms where democracy, trade, and reconstruction could anchor, but learned that pressure alone could not bake a lasting order. The workable recipe became credible deterrence paired with viable offers of cooperation. That pairing allowed allies to accept reforms and adversaries to decline provocations without losing face. In today's crises, arguments about inspections and transparency are the living descendants of the Baruch debate. It failed because it tried to front-load trust that only procedures can create. The consequence for our era is austere. Stability that passes the test of fear exists only where signals, means, and law align. Where they align, brinkmanship finds fewer buyers. Where they diverge, noise becomes a weapon and miscalculation starts to look like strategy. What remains when the dust of archives settles and the microphones are switched off, the years 1945 to 1949, show that diplomacy under a monopoly grows faster, harder, and more vulnerable to misunderstanding. They also show that the courage to limit power is the highest form of strength. America translated power into order because it built alliances and forced the logic of the bomb into rules. The world escaped a clean break in Berlin because the unspeakable stood in the room like an invisible wall. The truest inheritance is that superiority is responsibility rather than license. If new technologies again create monopolies, will we remember the lessons of the first nuclear years? Or will we once more believe that flashes of light can replace negotiation?